So what I'm going to cover today then, the importance of communication skills in just about everything that we do, and certainly in every aspect of business. The components of communication. So we'll break it down and look at what is involved and indeed why it is so difficult, because we all assume that communication is going to be easy, but it's not at all. And some of the reasons that it is so difficult is because of the various barriers to good communication that there are. And so we'll have a look at what some of those barriers are. And it's important to understand that not everyone communicates in the same way. We each have our own style, and it's useful to know what that style is and to understand where other people might be coming from and with their style. So we'll look at communication styles as well. And then obviously we'll have a little look at how we might be able to improve our own communication skills. And we will finish up with the type of questions that you might get asked around communication at interviews and what the employer's looking for. And obviously with communication skills, as I said, it goes across so many of the different skills that it opens it up to an awful lot of different types of questions. So we'll look at, there's a fairly good range, we'll look at a range of those questions. So just a heads up, if you've only just joined me, if you could take a second to grab a pencil and or pen and paper, and as I says, just for an activity later on in the session, it's not essential for the session, but it would be useful for the activity. And for an entirely separate activity later on, I'm putting a link into the chat, which you can open. Mary, it's that adjectives one. So if you can put that into the chat at any stage now. Thank you. It's a little exercise about communication style, and I'm going to cover that later on, and I'll probably give you 3 minutes to do it later on in the session. But I also know that some of you might like to take a little bit more time, or just to have sight of it before we get to that stage. So if you want to have a look at it now, you can go ahead. If you can multitask, go right ahead and do that. It's the adjective pairs exercise, and Mary's just put it into the chat there. Okay. Okay, so I'd like to start the session by explaining why the topic's important in the first place, especially when you're planning for interviews. Now, when you go to an interview, you're often asked, you're most likely to be asked what your strengths and your skills are. And chances are you will list communication, you'll list communication skills as one of those things. And you really should do, because no employer is going to want someone who doesn't have that skill. It's so, it is valuable in everything that you do. So communication is one of the most valued skills that employers look for, along with a positive attitude and self-motivation. And they're sort of banded as the super skills. So people always say that they have good communication skills. So it's important to understand what this really means and to be able to give examples of how you can demonstrate your communication skills. So there's no point in saying, I've got good communication skills, and then they say, give me an example of that, and you're, well, because obviously that's not giving a demonstration of your good communication skills. So be aware of it. And have evidence for it. It might be working within a team. It could be problem solving skills. It could be presenting skills, customer care. It might be written communication, or it might be verbal communication. The main thing is that you understand what it takes to communicate well, and you have good examples of doing this, and also examples, almost as importantly, of when communication has gone wrong, because it goes wrong for everybody, and it shows that you understand communication, especially if you can say, what went wrong. So, of course, if you can give an example of when something has gone wrong, you also want to show what you've learned from it and what you would do differently. And I give you this just as an example of when communication goes wrong. So as I say, as well as having examples of good communication, it's also really important to recognize lack of clear communication. And when there are problems at work generally, it is almost inevitable that people will say there was a lack of communication. We hear that all of the time. It comes up again and again. When something goes wrong, the first thing that will be blamed is lack of communication. So, be conscious of that. So now stick with me through this bit. It's probably my most complicated series of slides so far. I'm going to show you the components of communication, and hopefully it will demonstrate to you how easy it is for it all to go wrong, because there's just so many components to it. So let's have a look at the process of what actually takes place during communication. It's always a two-way process, and that's very important. Because in order for communication to have taken place, the message has to have been received. And problems arise whenever people believe that their message has been received in a specific way when it hasn't. So communication isn't whenever someone says something, it's whenever the message has been received. It always has to be a two-way thing. So the sender or the speaker encodes the message. We're not talking computers here. We're talking about the individuals encoding the message, in that they decide what they want to say and how they want to say it. Now, obviously, we do that unconsciously most of the time. We don't think about it. We rarely take time to consider how exactly we're going to say something. We do it as we've learned to do it. That's not always the right way to do it, but we learn to do it in a certain way. But of course, if we were maybe preparing a presentation or something like that, or indeed for an interview, we would consciously take time to decide how we were going to say something. So you're maybe more aware of that encoding the message whenever you're actually preparing to communicate. Okay. The speaker then decides what they want to say and how they want to say it. They transmit the message. So the sender transmits the message. And it's important to understand that the message that we transmit is not just the words we use, but also our tone of voice, our body language, and any other visual cues that will also send a message to the receiver. So, it's important to be aware of all of that. The receiver then has to decode the message. And there may be many reasons, and we'll look at some of that later, why this message gets decoded in a way that was not the sender's intention. So the receiver may misinterpret the words or the body language, or they might filter out parts of the message to fit in with what their own preconceived ideas are. There are so many things that are involved. It's lucky if we ever get a message received how we intended it to be. And believe me, I train in this subject. I have trained in this subject for many years. I have lots of experience in it. But, you ask my husband about our communication, and he'll say, that I think he should be telepathic, and I think he has selective hearing. So, you don't always get the communications right. But this is about knowing what is involved, and it's about learning from it and being able to talk about it. So you're not going into an interview to talk about the sender and the receiver and encoding message and decoding messages. This is really just to give you the understanding of what's involved and the knowledge of how things can go so easily wrong. Okay, so when the receiver has decoded the message and then responds, they become the sender. And they will go through the same process of encoding their message and transmitting it, and then feedback is given. So you can see that in a conversation, each party is in a constant process of coding, transmitting, decoding, coding, transmitting, decoding, etc., etc. It's complicated and it's fraught with mistakes. So again, when we say that we're good at communication, we mean that we are able to send out messages that are received in a way that we intend for them to be received. And all of that is really just to show you how complicated it is, how difficult it can be to get it right, how easy it is to get it wrong, and how understandable it is to get it wrong as well. So, just with all the knowledge of what that sort of entails, we'll move into, what sort of barriers there are and why we might have difficulties. So, even if you're trying your best to communicate well, there can be obstacles in the way. So it's worth looking at some of the barriers to communication that might prevent what your intended message is getting through. So you've got your physical noise distractions. Obviously, if they can't hear you, then that's a problem. Emotional fears, it could be lack of trust. It could be just the mood that the person is in. If the person already doesn't trust you or the situation, then they will most likely put barriers up to the communication. Perception and assumptions. There may already be assumptions made that make it very hard to get new information through. And then language and words and the jargon, accents, culture. There could be problems with the use of a language, maybe with professional speak for, jargon. Even things like someone's accent could be an issue. The lack of clarity then, when I'm designing a PowerPoint, one of the biggest problems for me is just cutting out vast amounts of information. But the keep it simple principle is definitely one of the best ways of making your communication successful. So, a lot of slides that go into my PowerPoints end up coming out again to try and keep things as simple and as tight as possible, especially whenever you're being kept to time as well. And I think sometimes that when you say simple, it sounds a bit like, dumbing it down because of the level of intelligence of the listener, but it isn't that at all. It's really about removing distractions, removing distractions from the message that you want to send out. So taking out what is not needed so that what actually is needed and what is important stands out. And that takes skill. And it also requires you to make an effort and to be conscious of the other person's needs. So the sender's lack of ability can be another issue in terms of a barrier. It might be that the sender's lack of skill, but of course, that won't be an issue for you because you're going to be very skillful after all of this, especially after this session. It could simply be, a barrier could simply be that the receiver is not listening. So the receiver deliberately puts barriers up and doesn't listen. And then not checking for understanding. So you've said what you're going to say and you assume that they have interpreted it in the way that you intended. But you don't actually know that. And the only way to know how they have received the information is to ask them. So, check that you're both meaning and saying the same thing. Another barrier then can be bad timing. So imagine that your colleague is up to their eyes with work, really under pressure, maybe on the phone or something. Clearly, that's not the time to try and get your communication across. So choose your moment. Bad timing can be one of the culprits, the barriers in terms of lack of communication. And then being human. So, memory and concentration, sometimes even with the best of intentions, we can just lose concentration or forget. So there might be some content there that will be, help you to formulate some of your interview answers, maybe around failing to communicate or difficulties with communication. So if you have an example of, when communication went wrong, do you have an awareness that there might have been some barriers to communication in the first place? Are any of those examples of what that might have been? So there might be something there that could be helpful for you in an interview answer or preparation for an interview answer. Okay, so I thought I'd try and do this little activity to demonstrate how hard it can be to communicate. Now, this is the one that I'd asked you if you have access to a pencil and paper. So, if you want to have that ready now, Mary, you might even want to try and do this one as well. And if you can, then do the activity. It's only a bit of fun, but it is a good illustration of communication. Having said that, trying to do this online is not ideal, folks, but I thought I'd give it a go and see how it went. Sometimes we don't know if the communication will work until we try it out. So this could go well, it could be a disaster. I might not even know because I might not get the feedback from you, but we'll try it out anyway. As I say, it's only a bit of fun, and I'm saying that very specifically. It's only a game, it's only a bit of fun. But if nothing else, it can be an example of how communication can go wrong. So the picture on the slide is how I would have liked to do this if we were all sitting in a room in real life. I would maybe pair you up and maybe get one of you to describe a drawing to the other. As I said, it's just a little communications game. But this time I'm going to be the describer and you can be the illustrator. So I better see if I can get my thing that I want to describe to you. So if you have a pen and paper or a pencil and paper available, then you don't need to have any artistic skills for this. I'm basically just going to describe something to you and you can draw it. Now, this is the exercise where I said that if you want to unmute and ask questions, then you're very welcome to, because it is about communications. And as I said to you, communications is two ways. So you need to be able to ask questions. Now, if you're not happy to unmute, if you want to put questions into the chat, maybe Mary, you could feed them back to me so that I can keep up with things. It'll only be, a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes or something like that. Okay. So, as I said, it's not a test of anyone's skill. I will not be examining your drawings. It's just a bit of fun. And I'll explain why I'm saying to you that it's only a bit of fun later on. Okay, so if you take your piece of paper and if it's say an A4 sheet or a notebook, try and put it portrait style, and that means the short length across the top. And if you're not actually going along with me, we'll find this a wee bit slow, but if any of you are actually drawing, then I'm giving you some time to do that. So we're going to start with 3 shapes. Now, these 3 shapes are stacked one on top of the other, and each one takes up about 1/3 of the page. So I haven't told you what those shapes are yet, but you know that they're going to be about 1/3 of the page. So working from top of the page to the bottom of the page. So on the top, taking up about 1/3 of the page is a triangle. So go ahead and start drawing your triangle. I see a hand up. Is there a question there?
Yes, I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Yeah, it was just, is the question, is the question, is the triangle inverted or is it upright?
Well, let's take it as an equilateral, and we'll stick a point, we'll stick the point of the triangle at the top of the page. Good question.
Thank you.
Good question, and maybe others will be able to pick that up as well. Okay, if you've got your triangle drawn, below that is a circle. And again, you're taking up 1/3 of the page. And then below that is a square. And you can also come on and say if I'm going too fast for you. So back up to the triangle then. Inside the triangle,
Róisín,
there are 3.
There was another hand. Did
someone
have a question?
Yes, I actually had a question.
Sure.
The square at the bottom, is it in relation to the other 2 shapes the same size? Like, are they all the same size, roughly?
Yeah, roughly the same size, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Okay, so inside the triangle are 3 5-pointed stars. But let's not get too hung up on that. They're 3 stars. And then inside the square is a heart, which is almost the size of the square, pretty much taking up the inside of the square. Okay, now outside of the square, you might not have room, maybe you haven't left room, doesn't really matter, don't worry. Outside of the square on either side is 2 rectangles with the narrow end closest to the square. So 2 rectangles with the narrow end closest to the square. And then inside the circle are some shapes basically going to make up a face. So there are 2 circles, a triangle, and an arc, which is the mouth. So you've got 2 circles for eyes, a triangle, pointy bit at the top, and an arc, which is the mouth. And that's it. So any questions before I reveal what the picture was like?
I have a question.
Sure.
Is the face happy or sad?
It's a happy face in my picture. Good question.
All right, thank you.
Anybody else want to ask anything to finish off their pictures? Okay, so I mean, I'm very happy if anyone wants to put their cameras on and show their pictures or whatever, that's absolutely fine by me. It's not necessary. There will still probably be different interpretations of this drawing because people will, pick things up differently. But I guess I should show you what my drawing was like, and then you'll know how close yours were to it. So, any comments? Anybody want to tell me how close they were, how far off they were? Claire?
Yeah, that was pretty close.
Yeah.
Do you want me to put the camera on and show you?
If you
It's
want
not
to,
exact-
Claire. If you're happy to, Claire,
Oh.
we're happy to see it. Just about see that, yeah. Okay.
Can you see that okay? Just
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for taking part there. So, folks, I have used this game now. This is, as I said, this is the first time I've done it online, but I've used it in real life many, many times. And sometimes I have been surprised by the reactions that people can have to it. And that's why I made it very clear at the beginning that, it was just a bit of fun and not to be taken too seriously. And, I'm talking about my experience of using this in real life sessions, as I said, because I've never done it online before. But I've had experience of people, let me just see here. So, experience of people maybe who are drawing the picture because I'm not usually the one that's doing the drawing or the describing. So for the people who are drawing the picture, I've seen people become so frustrated that they got really angry with the person that was describing it. That they're not giving them the right detail or enough detail or whatever. And I've seen people get stuck in a tiny detail and not move beyond it so that they never got a picture drawn at all. It wasn't the same picture that I've described to you now, but not, just an abstract picture. And I've also seen people get stuck and not understand. And then they just copy, they look to the person beside them and copy what somebody else has done, even though they've no idea if that person was correct or not. And then for the person doing the actual describing, and now remember, I have had time to prepare how I was going to describe this picture, and I wrote it down so that I could just read it out to you. And I've deliberately made it as simple, as I could really. But imagine if I had never seen that picture before, and I had only 2 minutes to describe it to you, because that's normally the way that I would do this in real life. So, chances are I'm likely to get maybe a bit tongue-tied over it, not able to think of a way to describe it, to be precise enough for everybody. I'm very likely to not be very methodical about it, maybe likely to skip things and, panic about the time slipping away, especially if I'm in the corner saying, oh, you've only got 30 seconds left and stuff. But the biggest challenge is that generally people do not ask questions. So I was really pleased that people actually did come on and ask questions there. So thanks very much for that. Because, when they don't understand, they just tend to put their own interpretation on it rather than checking. And in this situation, it's only a game. It doesn't matter at all. But I'm trying to use this to demonstrate to you communication in real life as well. So as I say, it doesn't matter, in this, but in real life, it could matter very much. And another problem is that the communicator doesn't check with the listener. So I didn't really check with you. And, I think that with communication, we all tend to think that the problem is always with someone else. They didn't listen. They didn't pay attention. They didn't understand, rather than I didn't say it in a clear enough way, or I didn't ask the right questions of them, things like that. So we tend not to think, oh, I didn't communicate that very well. So for me, the starting block with communication is always to look at yourself and examine how you communicated something. So think about what you intended to communicate and why it might have come across in a different way. And the final note there is, in choosing the best method of communication. Now, clearly what I wanted to do was to describe something to you verbally. When I do this live, I usually get the describer to put their hands behind their back, because the first thing that people do when they're trying to describe the drawing is they start drawing the shape in the air with their finger. Obviously, that's not the point of the exercise. But clearly, if I really wanted to communicate this drawing to you, then the easiest thing to do would be to show you the picture. Okay, so my choice of communication would be to use visual communication and show you what I'm trying to describe. And that's obviously one of the most important points as well in terms of communication, is to think about what the best way to get your message across is. So obviously, if it's something visual, then you'll want to use that and not just describe it verbally. Any questions or comments or likes or dislikes about that activity? Good activity. Okay. Okay. As I said to you, it works. I've never done it online before. I think that was probably quite successful, at least for some of you. I continue to do it. And as I said, I've done it an awful lot in real life. And sometimes I'm really shocked by how people's tempers can really rise, how people get very frustrated by it. And it's really a good example for other people in the room to see about how difficult communication can be, and how it can lead to such problems and such, frustrations and stuff. So I'll continue to use it. Okay, so the last exercise was very much about giving clear, precise information. Don't know, no thanks. Don't use it. I'm not sure what that means. Was about giving clear, precise information and instructions. But often we want to do more than that. We want to actually engage people and possibly even entertain them, get feedback from them. And to do that, you have to engage with them. So, if you want to actually engage them, you have to do more than just put on your sort of instructional voice. So we're using our tone of voice, our body language, and maybe, to demonstrate our enthusiasm as well. You have to sort of keep the voice at an enthusiastic level. So we use our command of the language. We're using words, the type of words to keep our audience interested and make the topic sound more exciting. And I always think if you can't demonstrate, your enthusiasm for a topic, then you're not going to get your audience to feel remotely enthusiastic about it at all. So that's definitely one of the things in terms of communication, is how you get your message across will depend on how you actually feel about the message as well. So, if we want people to be more engaged, then we have to make an effort to engage them. So you might be asking questions, and basically taking notice of the other person. So, you're looking at your audience. I can't really do that today, but you're looking at your audience, you're listening to them, you're responding to questions, maybe smiling and nodding, and I'll do a little bit on active listening shortly, but those are the sort of things that'll help to enhance your communication. Okay. So first, a little bit on nonverbal communication. Now, I'm sure a lot of you will already have seen this formula, the Murabian Formula. It's quite old research, and there's definitely some research to refute it. So I don't want to get too caught up in the formula here, the percentages. But ignoring the percentages, I mean, I firmly believe that when we communicate with people, we need to be aware of our tone of voice. We need to be aware of the actual words that we're using and of our body language. And for example, if I say, I'm not angry, while banging the table, then, you'll tend to believe that in fact I am angry. And I think an obvious one, probably one that we've all seen, is, someone shouting, I am calm, when they've been asked to calm down. Okay. So, the language, the body language and the words tend to match up whenever you're actually being true to yourself. So be conscious of what, the combination of those things say about yourself. So when we're giving a presentation, for example, we don't want to appear nervous because we know that it impacts our message. So all of these things add up to how we communicate, and it would be wrong to just concentrate on the words that we use. And most of the time, we don't tend to think too much about our body language unless it's a specific situation. For example, an interview, and you might think about how you're sitting, and you might think about your eye contact and maybe even the handshake that you do. So, you think about the body language for specific situations. You also need to consider it if you're having, a difficult conversation with a colleague, for example, if you're wanting to show confidence, if you're, just giving instructions and you want to show confidence in that, if you're maybe wanting to show empathy with someone, say you're listening to someone's problem. So again, remember that it's not just about the words. And again, if you're formulating an interview answer, consider how your tone of voice, your body language, and the method of communication might also fit into your answer. So that being said, I don't think that body language is something to get too hung up on. Generally, it's something that we tend to do fairly naturally. I don't think that it's important to learn what every gesture means, because there are too many exceptions. And what is important is that we know the body language is important to our communication. We're aware of it and that we pay attention to it. And I think that it's important is that, we're often communicating on 3 levels, and I will call them the head, the heart, and the briefcase. So what are the facts of the situation? How does the person feel about the situation? What are the emotions involved? And what does the person intend to do about the situation? What is the intention? So sometimes one aspect will be more important than other aspects, and they're not always equally important to each of the parties involved. So, think about it in terms of, if you have examples that you want to talk about in your communications, what were the facts involved? Was there emotions involved? And what were the intentions of both parties? And always be thinking of it not just from your side, but from the other side as well. Okay, so now I said I'd also talk a little about your communication style. And for this, I'm using Herman's whole brain thinking. And this is where the exercise that Mary put the link into the chat is, but I'll also put it up on the screen so you don't have to have that link. So Herman began by trying to find out what made people creative. And then he realized that basically people have preferences for how they think. And some people have very strong preferences, and some are more balanced across the 4 thinking styles that he put forward. So the exercise, I hope you can see this okay. So I thought I would give you just the opportunity to find out what your thinking style is, if you haven't already done this before. If you already know, then great. So this was the link that Mary put into the chat. Some of you might have already started it, but essentially there are 24 pairs of words here. For each pair, you simply choose the word that you think is most like you, or the word that you prefer. And each word is written in a color, yellow, red, green, or blue. And you just add up the words that you chose in that particular color. So, you'll have 5 blue, 3 red, that kind of thing. If you're not entirely sure what each word means, don't worry. Just go for the one that you feel you prefer anyway. The one that sort of flumps most people is quantitative and synthesizer. And I would probably just say either data or patterns. That's how I would interpret that one. So I'm just going to put my timer on for about 3 minutes, and hopefully most of you will get it done in that time. And when you get it done, if you could maybe put a thumbs up into the chat, or if you're not doing it and you're happy to go ahead, just put a thumbs up so that we know when we can move on. And I don't actually need your results for this session. So, you don't have to do it or anything, but it's there for you just to get the most out of the session. And don't think too hard about it. You just really want to tally on that, on those colors. Oh, somebody couldn't access. You can just do it from the screen, folks. You don't actually need the link. You can just do it from what's on the screen. There's nothing different in the actual link. You're really just looking at those pairs, choosing one word from each pair, and counting up the colours. So we're already at 2.5 minutes, so just another half minute, and hopefully that will get most of you finished. So, Mary, would you say that that's quite a few people finished it then?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, quite a few.
yeah. I'll give it maybe just another few seconds to let a few folk just finish it. Coming in thick and fast now, I think.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
probably the
Okay,
majority.
grand. All right then. So when you have your tally, you could plot it across the 4 quadrants of the whole brain thinking. So you're basically just going to, plot your numbers. If you're green here, you'd put your number here. But essentially, all you really need are your numbers, so that you have a rough idea of where your biggest scores are. Okay. So then, what do the 4 colors mean? So I should say, so you could be balanced across all 4 of these, or you could have one number that's much bigger than the others. It just depends. So it'll be different for all of you. But the 4 quadrants then in the thinking style. So have a look. If you have one number that's particularly big, then that's the one that you're most drawn to that thinking style. So the blue quadrant is our more analytical thinker. They're all about the facts. They want their information to be brief, to be clear and precise, and they're all about the critical analysis. Then if your highest score is yellow, then you're more experimental in your thinking. You look for the big picture or the overview. You tend to be more imaginative and more conceptual in your thinking. Our green quadrant then, which is the practical, process-driven thinker who wants the details, needs to follow the rules and procedures, wants information to be thorough, and tends not to go off on a tangent. So they're the people that will keep you on topic. And finally, then the red color is the relational quadrant. And this style of thinking is concerned with people's feelings and with values. So they're more likely to communicate using metaphors, stories, and examples. So you can see, with each of those different styles, if you're more concerned with numbers or with the facts, or you're someone who's more concerned with feelings or with the big picture thinking, you'll have a different way of communicating that as well. So you'll have your own preferred style of communication. But that does not mean that you cannot flex across other styles. If you have knowledge of the other styles, then you can flex across those styles as well. So for example, if I knew that a customer was asking for the facts and figures around a product, then they probably are not interested in the story behind it, how it all came about. But perhaps another customer with a red people thinking style might be more interested in what customer reactions are to the product, for example. So when I described the drawing to you before, I quite methodically broke it all down into shapes, and I tried to give you, proportions, and I even told you what way to turn your page, portrait style. Now, can you see that if I had a different thinking style, I might I might communicate that differently. So I might start by saying something like, okay, I'm going to ask you to draw a picture of a person, and this person is made up of different shapes. So I might have started with the big picture, and maybe I wouldn't have been too concerned with the proportions, for example. If I was a red people-oriented thinker, I might say, draw a cartoon figure with a big smile and a big heart. Okay, so it's different across different thinking styles. So if you looked at the picture afterwards and thought that you would have described it entirely differently, if you had taken a different slant on that, then chances are it's because you have a different communication style to the one that I have or the one that I tend to use. So if people all have different thinking preferences, can you see how their communication will also be very different? How Red might get very bored with a detailed analysis of something when what they're interested in is how it is going to make people feel. So if you were communicating to a group and you didn't know what their thinking preferences are, you might try and balance the information by giving, a little bit of everything. So perhaps putting the detail into a handout, for example, for those that, want more detail. If you give me a page with lots of statistics and numbers on it, I will never look at it. But our blue thinker probably would. That's probably what they're going to be most interested in. So hopefully that'll give you some idea of your communication style. And again, you can talk about how your style is essentially this, but you like to balance it with other styles to get your message across fully. And again, if you're trying to give examples of why you communicated in a certain way to a certain group of people, it might be that you can pull something from this as well. Just to sort of give you richer examples. So when we're talking about communication style, it's important to remember that it's not just how we communicate that is important, but also how others communicate to us. So if you have a particularly strong preference for one quadrant rather than a more sort of, balanced style across the quadrants, listening to someone else with a different style might prove quite challenging. And obviously the same is true for people listening to you. And this communication, it's not just about how you communicate verbally, but also in writing too. So the emails that you send, the reports that you write, they'll also come from your communication style as well. And the people that are reading them will have their own communication style too. So think about it. I know it starts to make things quite complicated whenever you think about people having different communication styles and having to do things differently for that range of people. But it is really just about trying not to stick to one particular style and balancing it up. So we might see, the blues whenever we're thinking of how other people communicate. We might see the blues, for example, as maybe cold and calculating because they're all about the numbers. We might see the yellows as a bit unfocused or heads in the clouds. They're all about the big picture. And then the greens might be seen as bossy because it's all about the rules and procedures and maybe a wee bit of nitpicking. And our reds can be seen as oversensitive and a bit emotional because they're all about the people. So, we can see differences in people's thinking by how they respond to ideas, the type of questions that they ask, and even sometimes how their workspace is organized, what's important to them. But when they send out emails, how they describe things, of course, how they relate to other people as well. And remember that if we're only willing to communicate in one way, then we're inevitably going to leave some people behind in our communications. So if you want to get through to the most people, then you have to be able to flex that style, to flex across the different styles. Anybody have any questions before I move off that? Happy for you to put into the chat or to unmute, whichever suits. Okay, happy enough. So I want to talk a little bit then about listening. So often whenever people talk about communication, they forget that listening is one of the biggest communication skills. So don't forget to mention that if you're discussing communication skills at an interview, remember to also mention listening. So try to think of an example of a time that you used your listening skills, maybe to solve a problem or to avoid a mistake. If you're involved with any sort of voluntary work or teamwork where listening maybe is a priority, then make sure to use those sort of examples. If you have customer care experience for any industry, it's always useful because you'll always have internal or external customers. And so, working with colleagues is also a good example. So, think about the different sort of job roles that you have and how you might use your listening skills in them. So have a look at the summary then of active listening. And the word active is there intentionally because the intention is to actually listen well. So start with be attentive, give the person your full attention. Ask open-ended rather than closed questions. And I think sometimes it's funny to see, an example of listening and then you're saying, well, ask questions. But of course, asking questions is a part of listening, because it's about getting the right information from someone. So ask open-ended rather than closed questions. Ask probing questions, both to show that you're interested and also to find out more. Request clarification. So, have that check-in with the person to make sure that what you're hearing and what they're saying to you are the same thing. Paraphrase. So just, a short summing up to make sure that you are correct in your thinking and your understanding. Be attuned to and reflect feelings. So, notice people's body language and try to understand and empathize with how they're feeling. Being able to hold a silence is also very important at the appropriate time. It's important and it's a very powerful form of listening. So giving the person time and space in the conversation to say more. And finally, I know that the giving someone silence wasn't up there, but I thought I'd add that in. And finally, summarize to make sure that you're clear and have taken on board everything. So again, some key phrases if you want to be able to answer questions about listening at interview. Obviously, if you're going for a job as a counselor or something, some job like that where listening's a prime skill, then you'll need more than that, obviously. But for most communication questions, that will, this sort of thing will cover you for listening. So let's have a little roundup of some thoughts on communication. Remember that everyone says they have good communication skills, but you have to know that communication is hard to get right. So, start with that thought that communication is hard. It's a two-way process. It's important in every job and in all aspects of life. And getting it wrong can cause mistakes and frustrations. And it's also very easy to do to get wrong. We've all done it. And here's a few little reminders about some of the skills. So watch out for body language, actively listen, use empathy, remove any barriers to communication that you can, ask open rather than closed questions. And I think I did mention don't make assumptions because that's definitely where communication can fall down. Okay, folks, that's sort of me finishing on the topic. Have you any questions before we move on to the interview questions? Okay, so if you've done this with me before, you'll be well aware of this, but I have to go through it again for anybody who hasn't been on one of these sessions. So interview preparation. So just to remind you of the STAR technique, it's basically for effectively answering your interview questions. And basically you want to be able to tell the interviewer your story around the question. So by putting your answer into context for them, it helps them to understand as well. So when you're formulating your answer for your interview, when you're preparing your answers or when you're doing it actually in the interview, try and follow the STAR technique. It makes your answers clear and logical, and it means that you're getting across the main points that you need to the interviewer. So start by listening to the question, think of your example that you're going to use. Hopefully you'll already have prepared these well ahead of the interview. But even if you're thinking on your feet, frame your answer into situation, task, action, and result. And so describe the event or the situation that you were in. Explain the task that you had to complete. What were the challenges involved in it? Describe the specific actions that you personally took to complete the task. And you can say, if you were working in a team, you can say what the team did, but you should also say what you personally did, because you're the person being interviewed. Finish with the results. What was the results of your actions? Were there benefits? Were there savings? What was the impact? So that's your sort of framework for preparing your interview answers. And here are some examples of questions. So tell us about a time when you used written communication to successfully influence someone. How did you go about structuring your writing? Now, I haven't specifically covered written communication, but much of what we have talked about will still apply. So knowing your audience, using appropriate language and, jargon, removing jargon perhaps, giving the level of detail required. If you know what their thinking style is, all the better, but otherwise balancing it out across the quadrants. Talk about being clear and concise and courteous, giving the benefits, etc. And always start with choosing the best method of communication. So it could be a business report, but we also know that, this huge impact that a tweet or an Instagram post can have, especially when you're limited to words or even letters. You have to make each word count. So, even a tweet could be a good example of written communication if you can show the benefits of it. You might also say things like laying out your case in a clear, methodical way, or it might be telling a story if that's the audience that you have. Emphasizing important points, having clear conclusions and recommendations, being clear about what your request is, if there is one, all of those sort of things. So there's lots of stuff that you can put in there. Mary, you're welcome to join in at any stage if you want to add anything in for any of these.
Okay.
Yep. So demonstrate how you vary your communication approach according to the audience you're addressing. And this would not only be about communication style, but also things like, the age of your audience, the level of knowledge that they have. So a presentation, for example, that you might give to a bunch of experts would not be the same one that you would give in a primary school, even though it might be on the same topic. So there could be different levels of knowledge in the group. The purpose of the talk, is it giving information? Is it entertaining? Etc., etc. The next one then, tell us about a situation where your communication skills made a difference to a situation. So again, if you can think of how you're able to explain a situation, calm a situation, show the benefits, maybe encourage others to participate. Okay, just have something ready. Tell us about a situation when you failed to communicate appropriately. And I do think, especially with communication, that you are likely to be asked things about when things didn't go well. So, it really is good to have something in the bag for that one. Something that you can say you've learned from and how you would do it differently now. And then describe a situation where you had to explain something complex to a colleague or a client. Which problems did you encounter and how did you deal with them? So, make sure that you listen carefully to your questions and that you're, especially if it's a double-barreled one, that you're getting each bit answered. It might be appropriate to talk about communication styles there, perhaps about the method of communication. So a visual aid might help, or a face-to-face rather than an email or over the phone. Think about what would be the best way to think that one through. And remember, so those are all the questions I have. Remember to put your answer into the STAR framework. Position your response in, a good, strong, positive way. So even if the communication was not entirely successful, or even if it was uncomfortable for you, give this sort of detail about it, but make sure that you're putting in, and here's what I do differently, because here's what I've learned from it. And obviously, tailor your answers to the sort of job that you're going for as well.
Yeah, Róisín, just to add in there, as you mentioned, the results part of STAR is really important. So sharing what you learned or how you would do things differently, or any results of the conversation is always important.
Yeah.
Yep. Just like you said.
Any questions from anyone?
I don't see anything coming in.
Well, we'll hang around for a little bit anyway. I just want to sort of also let you know about some more sessions still coming up in development weeks. So where are we? We are at effective communication skills. So the next session then, Mary, I think you're doing that one with me as well, is on the 28th of May, understanding your behavioral preferences. If you are attending that one, folks, there is a questionnaire to do for that one beforehand. And you will get much more out of the session if you've already done the questionnaire. So that's just a heads up for that one. The information should be in the details. Communicating assertively, active resilience, and influencing and negotiating skills, all on the Development Week's website, which I think we have a link for you we can put into the chat. And Mary, if we could also then put in the evaluation link, if you would be so good as to fill in the very short evaluation as well, please. But meanwhile, myself and Mary are still here to answer any questions for you. I'm not a careers consultant. Mary's, one of our professional careers consultants. So you've got both of us here for the price of one. And, now's a good time to get some of those questions answered if you have any burning questions.
And the evaluation is in the chat, and just underneath it is a link to Development Weeks.
Okay, good.
And I'll also drop the file for today's session if anyone wants to refer back to it.
Yeah, so the PDF for the slides. People are always very good about their thank yous on these online sessions.
Yeah. Looks like Claire has her hand raised.
Claire, go
Hi.
ahead. Is this
I've booked.
Claire with the drawing? Is it Claire?
This is me with the drawing, yes. Yes. I'm booked in for the event on understanding your behavioural preferences.
Yes.
On Friday, the 28th of May. But I was just wondering, whereabouts is the questionnaire that you have to fill in? Is there a link somewhere, or did you say it and maybe I missed it?
No, so it should be in the detail for the course, but I wonder, could I find that for you and put that link into here as well? Mary, would you be able to, just the 16 personalities one?
Yeah.
Thank you.
It should be, whenever you're booking it, there should be the detail about that, but
Just the free personality test?
Yeah.
There might be, I could have missed it,
Yeah.
but I just wasn't sure.
Sorry.
It's definitely worth doing it before you come to the session. It's not totally essential, but you will get more from the session if you've done the questionnaire.
Thank you.
I just dropped it in the chat.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure.
Mary, do you want to switch off the recording now?
Oh, yeah, good idea. I always forget to do that.